Okay, have you ever heard of the year 536 AD? My guess is probably not. But what if I told you that according to a whole bunch of historians and scientists, that one single forgotten year was the absolute worst year to be alive in all of human history? I'm not talking about a decade or an era, but one specific year that kicked off a chain reaction that would bring down empires and completely reshape the world. All right? Let's get into it.
I mean, that's a huge claim, right? The worst year ever. When you think about historical disasters, your mind probably jumps to a few other more famous dates. You might think of 1349, when the Black Death was tearing through Europe, or maybe 1918, with the Spanish flu hitting right at the end of the brutal First World War, or really any year during the world wars of the 20th century. But the argument here is that 536 AD was the catalyst, the very first domino to fall in a century-long crisis that was, in many ways, worse than any of them.
So what on earth happened in 536? Well, to put it as simply as possible, the sun went out. Not completely, but just enough to change absolutely everything.
To really get the shock of this, you've got to picture the world just 1 year earlier. In 535, things were actually looking up for the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium. The Emperor Justinian I had this huge ambition to reconquer the old Western territories and put the Roman world back together. And you know what? His armies were winning, trade was flowing, there was this real sense of momentum, a feeling that the future was bright.
And then, the sky changed. This quote comes from Procopius, a historian who was actually there, who saw it with his own two eyes. Just try to imagine that. For an entire year, the sun is just hanging up there in the sky like a dim, useless moon. No real warmth, no bright light, just this creepy, constant twilight that went on for 18 straight months. Here's another witness, a Roman statesman named Cassiodorus. He wrote about a world where the seasons just lost their meaning, a sun that looked blue and feeble. People back then had no way to explain this. It must have felt like the world was ending, like it was some kind of divine punishment they couldn't possibly understand.
And this wasn't just some weird light show. It had a real physical impact. Summer temperatures across Europe dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius. Now that might not sound like a lot to us, but for a society that lives and dies by its harvest, it is an absolute catastrophe.
And this wasn't just a local problem. Oh no. As you can see, this mysterious fog was global. Crops failed everywhere. We have records of snow in the middle of summer in China. Ice cores show us that severe droughts hit Peru. The growing season shrank by as much as 6 weeks. For a world without supermarkets or global shipping, this wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. So the people of the 6th century knew what was happening. They were living the nightmare, but they had no clue why. For us, the answer to this ancient mystery was found frozen in time, buried deep within the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica.
So how in the world did scientists figure this out? It's pretty amazing, actually. They drilled these super deep, long cylinders of ice. You can think of each layer of ice like a page in a history book. It's a perfect snapshot of 1 year's atmosphere. And when they got to the layer for 536 AD, they found the smoking gun, a huge spike of specific particles that could only have come from one thing.
And the culprit was a single, absolutely massive volcanic eruption in Iceland. It was so powerful that it blasted tons of sulfur and ash high into the stratosphere, creating this sort of veil that wrapped around the northern hemisphere and literally reflected the sun's light back out into space.
But here's the truly terrifying part. The horror of 536 wasn't just that one eruption. No, that was only the beginning. It was the first domino in a chain reaction of disaster that would keep going for more than 100 years.
Just look at this timeline. It's just one gut punch after another. After the 536 eruption, it only took a year or two for food reserves to run out, sparking massive famine. Then, in 540, while the world is still reeling, a second huge volcano erupts. Right on the heels of all that weakness and hunger comes disease. In 541, the plague of Justinian shows up. And then, unbelievably, a third, even bigger eruption hits in 547. It was a relentless, compounding crisis with absolutely no time to recover.
Now, this plague of Justinian, it was caused by the exact same bacteria as the Black Death that you've probably heard about. But here's the difference. The Black Death burned itself out after a few years. This pandemic, it came back again and again in waves and tormented the Mediterranean world for 200 years.
The human cost was just staggering. This number,
5,000. That's the estimated number of people dying every single day in the capital city, Constantinople, when the plague was at its worst. 5,000 people every day. The city's entire social and economic life just stopped.
And if you zoom out, the big picture is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Over those 2 centuries, the Mediterranean world might have lost between a quarter and half of its entire population. Think about that. The world was literally becoming emptier.
But out of all of this death and decay, something else was happening. This century-long crisis didn't just end an era. It completely cleared the geopolitical chessboard. The total collapse of the old world created a vacuum, a space for a completely new one to rise up from the ashes.
Just look at this comparison. Before 536, you basically had 2 superpowers running the show, the Byzantine and the Sasanian-Persian empires. But after 100 years of climate chaos, famine, plague, and fighting each other, they were just hollowed-out shells of what they used to be. They were still standing, sure, but their foundations, their people, their economies, their armies were shattered.
And this right here, this is a crucial turning point in world history. Into this massive power vacuum, a new force explodes out of the Arabian Peninsula. The Arab armies of the early Islamic Caliphate expanded with a speed that just stunned the world. And it wasn't only because of brilliant strategy. It's because they were pushing against imperial walls that were already crumbling from the inside out, thanks to a century of disaster.
And get this, the ice cores don't just tell us about the climate. They can actually show us economic data. This chart shows lead pollution trapped in the ice, which came from Roman silver smelting. Think of it as a proxy for the economy. More silver being made, more lead in the air. You can see it clear as day, the Roman peak, and then, after 536, a total collapse. The economy just flatlines for over a century, only starting to recover under a totally new civilization.
So, you have to ask, if this event was so massive, so completely world-changing, why was it almost totally forgotten for more than 1,000 years? Why don't we learn about this in history class?
Well, the answer is pretty simple, really. The people who lived through it could describe the horror in vivid detail, but they couldn't explain it. They didn't know about Icelandic volcanoes or atmospheric science. To them, it was the wrath of God, a terrible omen, some kind of inexplicable evil. The story of what happened was saved, but the cause was lost to time.
And that leaves us with a final, pretty cool question. The story of 536 AD was pieced together from ancient writings, tree rings, and of course, ice cores. It just makes you wonder, what other connections between huge natural disasters and the great turning points of human history are still out there, frozen in time, just waiting for us to find them?